All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to have you here today for this webinar. My name is Emily Bass. I lead food and agriculture policy for the Breakthrough Institute. For those that are not familiar, Breakthrough is a pro-growth and pro-technology environmental research organization. We're a nonprofit that advocates for bipartisan and durable policies that improve environmental and human development outcomes. When it comes to our food and agriculture work, we support technological solutions that enable a food supply that is productive, high yielding, abundant, affordable, accessible, and finally, sustainable. We are committed to an all of the above strategy to reduce agriculture's environmental footprint. We are quick to push back on the consequences of practices that might sound more natural or climate friendly, but that come with a drag on yields. And we try to elevate the uncomfortable truth that intensive agriculture is often better for the planet, but not without room for improvement. So, with all of that context in mind, Breakthrough is thrilled to host today's discussion featuring author Michael Grunwald and Earthjustice's Peter Lehner. They're with us today to dive into the possibilities and trade-offs that come with addressing agriculture's impact on the planet. One housekeeping note before we jump in, you can submit questions via the Q&A starting now. We encourage folks to submit questions as they come to mind. Our speakers will answer as many as they can throughout the conversation and during a designated Q&A portion at the end. The video recording of today's discussion will be made available by the end of the week. With that, I am now going to turn it over to Jenny Splitter, Editor-in-Chief of Sentient Media, who has graciously offered to moderate today's discussion. Jenny is going to introduce our speakers and kick off the conversation. So thanks for being here today.
Great, excited to be here. So I want to introduce our panelists. Michael Grunwald is best-selling author and columnist, and his most recent book, Why We Are Here, is titled "We Are Eating the Earth: The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate." We also have Peter Lehner, managing attorney of the Sustainable Food and Farming Program at Earthjustice and author of Farming for a Future: The Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture. So to get started, we're going to have Mike kind of lay out the case for why we are eating the earth and just give us kind of the big overview.
Well, thanks so much, Jenny. I appreciate the Breakthrough Institute doing this. Yeah, well, the sort of dirty secret is that agriculture is eating the earth, right? We kind of all know that when we take a cross-country flight, you see all those rectangles and circles out the window, and you say like, wow, there are a lot of farms out there. But there are a lot of farms out there, right? Right now, about 1 of every 100 acres of our planet is cities and suburbs. 2 of every 5 are farms or pastures. We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. And that's a big deal, right? I think, a lot of us know about the sort of energy and climate problem, but food and agriculture is 1/3 of our emissions. It uses about 70% of our fresh water. It's the leading driver of deforestation, of biodiversity loss, of water pollution, of water shortages. So it's a really big deal. And particularly on the climate side, these land use problems are they're a real problem, right? Trying to decarbonize the planet while we continue to destroy trees for agriculture, it's like trying to clean your house while you're smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You're making a huge mess, and you're also losing your ability to clean up the mess because forests end up soaking up about 1/4 of our carbon emissions. So we are in this really desperate situation where we're going to need 50% more calories by 2050. And we have to do it without tearing down any more forests. Right now, we are on track to deforest about another dozen California's worth of land by 2050. Somehow, we're going to have to reduce our agricultural emissions by about 75, 80% by then. And so it's basically we're going to have to reduce our demand for land. And we're going to have to increase our supply of food. So on the demand side, we're going to have to eat less meat, particularly in the rich world, because in the poor world, they're actually, the first thing people do when they stop being poor is they start eating meat. And that's a great thing. But right now, Americans eat about 4 times as much meat as the global average. That's going to have to come down, and particularly with beef, because beef uses about 10 times as much land and creates about 10 times as much emissions as chicken or pork. So it really is a ruminant meat problem. At the same time, we're going to have to waste less food, because when we waste food, we waste the we waste the farmland and the fertilizer and the water that goes to growing that food. And we're going to have to use fewer biofuels, because that's a crazy use of land. But biofuels right now are eating about a Texas worth of the earth, while agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. So we want to reduce that on the demand side. But then on the supply side, which is where people start to yell at me, is that we are going to have to make more food with less land. And that does mean high yield agriculture. A lot of people say like, oh, we don't really need to make more food. We can just eat less beef or waste less food or just do a better job distributing the food. But actually, the math really sucks. We do need to make more food. We are going to need a lot of it. And so a lot of these sort of low yield, regenerative, organic solutions that people like, that Michael Pollan writes beautifully about, to the extent that they make less food per acre, they are going to need more acres to make food. They are going to eat more of the earth. So that's why, the Breakthrough Institute, as Emily mentioned, has done a good job talking about this idea of sustainable intensification. And look, just making more food isn't going to be enough. That does not guarantee that we don't deforest the planet. But it is necessary if it isn't sufficient. So I think we are going to talk today I write about dozens of promising solutions in the book about, different ways that people are gene editing crops or even gene editing livestock. They're reinventing photosynthesis. They're doing alternative fertilizers and pesticides that are going to, help crops grow with much less mess. But that really is the goal, is how can we make even more food with fewer emissions, but with much less pollution and deforestation.
Great. And Peter, you want to maybe give us just a few of your thoughts on what were your reactions as you were reading this book? Oh, got to unmute first. Thank you.
First, thanks to the Breakthrough Institute for hosting. And it's a real pleasure to be here with Mike, who's written a terrific and important book and is helping raise attention on the fact that our agriculture system is in fact eating the earth and is at the same time a major driver of biodiversity loss, water pollution, and climate change. Most people don't know that. So just at the most fundamental level, it is really important that people understand that, because without understanding that, we never have pressure for change. And I think Mike's is right that all things being equal, we want to be a lot more efficient. And I think that is a very important message to get out. I think there are some issues that I wrestle with in trying to implement some of these solutions that might be interesting for folks. One is, I think that maximizing yield is sometimes a little more complicated than it may seem. Are you optimizing for the best year or for the worst year? Do you plant so that if everything goes right, you have a bumper crop? Or do you plant in a way that when things aren't so right, you still have a decent crop, don't go bankrupt, and still can produce some food? There are some real differences there at a practical level that we have to understand. And how do you balance yield with some of these other issues that are both environmentally important and, again, politically important? They're important because, for example, if a high yield system creates a lot of animal suffering or a lot of local water pollution or destroys rural communities, that has a lot of political impact that then, as we try to move forward in fixing the food system, there are impacts we have to think about. So how we maximize yield has some nuances that are tricky. Another issue, and again, Mike talks about this in his book, and those of us who've worked in the area face it a lot, is there's sort of a paradox that by making land more productive, you may make it more profitable. And that has the local impact of making the landowner often want to convert more land, spend the money to convert more land. Now, there in theory is this macroeconomic force to say, well, if we're more productive, we won't need to convert more land because we're producing more on less. But we've often seen that, in fact, when folks are more productive and more profitable, they use their money to convince the government to create brand new markets for their product. Biofuels are the best example of that. We are having a government-enforced mandate for biofuels that make no economic sense, no climatic sense, but are there because of the political power of those landowners. So we have this, it's sometimes called Jevons paradox, that being more productive can actually lead to more land clearing. It's sort of like, and I'm sitting in New York on a very hot day, more efficient air conditioning makes it a little cheaper, so people sometimes think, I can turn the air conditioner down a few degrees and keep it running a little more. And that can be a challenge. A third issue we have to think about, again, from the political perspective, is that any justification for intensive systems like these animal factories can make it harder to build the political will to regulate their pollution. Mike talks correctly about the tremendous pollution these things produce. But when they're viewed as the best option, well, then we need not mess with them, right? And we've seen that in a lot of ways. The meat industry in the United States is very powerful. For example, they've been able to get through a budget rider every year through Congress that would prevent EPA from even requiring them to report, let alone do anything about their greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to think about how we talk about the intensive system in a way that does not give them the political power to avoid addressing their pollution. And until their pollution is addressed, you have a really unfair and uneven playing field for alternatives. And two more quick points. One is, and I don't know what to do with this, optimizing, for example, animal factories is a bit like optimizing a coal-fired power plant. Sure, we want a coal-fired power plant to be more efficient, but no matter what you do, it's still going to be a big polluter, and we don't get clean energy until we move to inherently clean systems. And similarly, we have to moved to inherently cleaner food production systems. No matter what you do, grazing an entire cow for some beef is really inefficient. And having all the attention on optimizing a fundamentally inefficient system sort of sucks the political will and the public pressure for these alternatives. So for example, now we have virtually no public support for, say, plant-based or cultivated meat alternatives. And finally, we deal often with consumer fraud, with the fact that there's almost a tsunami of consumer and public deception, largely by the meat companies, trying to minimize their impact. And so I wonder how we can talk about these intensive systems in a way that doesn't exacerbate the consumer deception that's going on out there. So again, I think these are all just issues we have to deal with as we try to move forward on solutions.
That's great. I think there's a lot to tease out there. And, you know, I think it's not, you know, nothing just to just point out that you largely agree in terms of there being kind of that the yields matter, that we do have to take into account how much people are eating when we think about alternatives. But I think some of the issues you're raising are things I also thought as I was reading this book, which is like when I first came across sustainable intensification as a concept, I thought, oh, this is great. This kind of like solves everything. And then I realized, oh, this has been around for a while. And, you know, the ag industry is great at the intensification part, not always so much at the sustainable part. And I think there's a real, you know, as you point out with a lot of the policies, like there just isn't a lot of reining in happening. So I want to put that to Michael, like what are kind of the best policy pathways for sort of making sure the expansion has some limits, and in this current political climate, I guess, like, are there any is one question. Like, what kind of is possible either now or maybe, down the road?
Well, I do always have to point out that, like, I write about like dozens of these solutions and none of them have really gotten a ton of traction. And people say, and they're really hard, right? If, if any of this were easy, we kind of would have done it already. And when I started writing about energy and climate like 20 years ago, and there were no alternatives to fossil fuels. And, you could have been just as woe as me as I sometimes sound like when I talk about the food and climate problems, where there isn't really a ton of progress being made. Things change, so that's the kind of I would start with that. Look, I mean, I get why people hate factory farms, right? Like they treat animals badly, they treat people badly, they use too many antibiotics, their politics suck. As Peter mentioned, they're like, they're constantly lobbying, to wriggle out of environmental regulations and climate action. They're not good. And Peter's also right to mention this rebound effect idea, this idea that even if we do increase yields, that just that sort of, particularly on the crop side, if a farmer in Brazil comes up with a way that he can double his yield, the first thing he's going to want to do is tear down more trees so he can grow more food and have more land. And those are definitely problems. The first thing you have to say is like, well, you kind of got to deal with it. If you don't increase yields, we're absolutely screwed, right? All of these problems, when I say we're on track to deforest another dozen Californias by 2050, that actually assumes that yields increase over the next 30 years at the same level that they've increased over the last 60 years since the Green Revolution. And we've actually tripled our crop and livestock yields since then. So that's assuming a lot of increase. If we don't increase yields at all, and it's going to be a lot harder with in this era of climate change, with more droughts, more floods, more heat waves, pests and diseases moving to new areas, we're going to need 3 dozen more California's worth of land. And like that, then you really are talking about we're going to need a planet B. So I will say that all this stuff really is necessary, even though it isn't sufficient. I don't want to go on and on about how we are going to get these big ag guys to do the right thing. It is going to be really hard, but I think the idea is that there is going to have to be globally and nationally some sort of grand bargain where globally the agricultural industry gets $300 billion in direct subsidies every year. And there are very few strings attached. And I think the goal should be that we are going to start to attach some strings where we are going to say like, hey, it's okay. We want you to make food. We want you to make even more food, but you're going to have to do it with less mess. That in the international scene, we're going to have this kind of produce and protect where it's linked, where we are going to help a country in the developing world support their farmers to increase their yields, but that money is going to be contingent on your forests have to remain standing. And again, it's like, fat chance, right? Well, yeah, it is going to be hard. What I will point out is that Denmark, and I know it's Denmark, they're like the model nation, they're Denmark, they do everything right, but they have basically passed the sort of like Mike Grunwald, Agricultural Reform Act of 2025, where they are going to rewild 1 million acres of farmland, of the marginal farmland, to send it back to nature. They are going to tax agricultural emissions. All those dairy cows burping are going to be taxed. They are going to promote plant-based eating throughout the country, but they are also going to invest in these solutions that can help make agriculture more productive and more climate friendly. They are going to invest in research to help farmers adopt the feed additives that help their cows burp less methane, the gene edited crops that will have higher yields and be more drought tolerant. So I do think like it can be done. I'm not saying it's going to be done, but I'm trying to say like, hey, here's a potential path. Here are at least the, here are the values we want. And so like energy has become a political problem. We know what to do. It's just a question of whether we do it. While food is still kind of an analytical problem. So we're just saying like, hey, the politics and the analysis is going to be hard, but I'm the guy kind of banging my spoon on my high chair saying like, hey, now is the time to start doing it.
Peter, well, since you actually are working with a lot of, I mean, this is like the thing that you're trying to kind of make sure happens in the US. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, like, are there any glimmers of hope, I guess, in the US, like any paths that make us turn into Denmark? I don't think that's happening, but maybe there's something that looks a little more plausible or possible than other paths.
Well, there were glimmers of hope. I think there are fewer now than there were 6 months ago. So, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, for the first time, Congress recognized that agriculture has a big impact on climate change. And that was huge, if you just think about it. Until in the 2018 Farm Bill, which is the main law that governs our food and farming system, I think it was over 800 pages long and never mentions greenhouse gases or climate change. So simply recognizing that connection was hugely important. One of the things that included was more R&D in the area. I don't remember the exact numbers, but agricultural R&D has a terrific payback to the public. And yet in the US, that public R&D has plummeted over the last 20 and 30 years. And we need to have a lot more R&D, not only into yields, but as Mike said, into doing it sustainably. And we just don't have that right now. I've spent years before I came to focus on the food system, on the energy system, and there's some good lessons there. One was that we had a lot of support for clean energy. And the fossil fuel industry was always trying to kill that support. I mean, we spent years in different litigation and state public utility commissions and the like to try to help the renewable industry, the renewable energy industry, grow to the point where it is now, where it is in fact cheaper to put solar panels up than to build a coal-fired power plant. Now, the current administration is trying to put additional roadblocks on, but that fundamental economics is really, really important. And we achieved it in part because of support for renewable energy in different sorts of ways. Inherently cleaner food production gets virtually no support right now. Mike's book talks about this, whereas it's all left up to the private sector to figure out how to compete with an industry that is politically powerful, has tremendous subsidies, tens of billions of dollars of subsidies every year, and a sort of a vast PR machine. It's hard to compete against that when you don't have any support at all. So one very simple thing is we need to think about those support systems, and that's R&D, that support system out in the field. And some of that was moving forward. Unfortunately, the most recent budget bill did just the opposite. For example, they have an extra, $60+ billion of subsidies to farmers, totally disconnected from doing anything careful or smart or sustainable with that money. There is a program in the Farm Bill called Conservation Compliance, which it's hard to call it strings on the money. It's like threads on the money, trying to make sure that farmers don't fill wetlands and have too much erodible land. But we need to have more programs like that where essentially the public says, hey, food is important. We're going to support our farmers, but you got to do it in a way that is good for the public. So I think we have those political models. We just need to build the political support to get some of those either retained, because many of them had their knees cut out from under them recently, or ideally expanded.
I wonder if we can talk just a little bit about trade-offs and like what is the best way to have policies that I guess have policy conversations about trade-offs that still kind of acknowledge reality. One thing I really liked in Mike's book was that there was a little discussion about Prop 12, which was kind of the biggest animal welfare law I think that was ever that has been passed so far, and that this one provision sort of makes sure that gestating pigs get just like a little bit more space, essentially, to move around. And even Tim Serchinger, who's kind of a bit of the hero of Mike's book, who's a researcher and who's like all about trying to make these emissions work, is like, hey, maybe that's a trade-off that we just deal with it if it's a little bit less efficient, but it basically allows for these animals to have just like a little bit more space. And I feel like these kind of notes where this actually happens a lot in your book, is just one of the reasons I like it, is that a lot of people who are like kind of have a very firm point of view and they want a certain outcome are also able to say, well, okay, I acknowledge this sort of weakness, or I acknowledge this other side. And I thought that was really great. I would like to see more of those conversations happening. But I guess that's what I'm getting at, is like, how can we kind of have conversations about trade-offs like Prop 12, like if, as we're acknowledging that, okay, factory farming just happens to be this like lower in emissions way of producing food, and also like it kind of sucks for chickens, right? Like it might be way lower in emissions, it's not great for chickens. So like, are there ways we can be thinking about these things that allow for some balance, where it's not just like maximalizing kind of the most low emissions food, although that has to happen too. I don't know, Mike, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where I think I haven't always been good enough, and and Jenny and others have sort of pointed it out, because obviously my book is sort of coming at it from it's called "We Are Eating the Earth," and a lot of it is about the impact on the earth, and sometimes I have sort of hand waved away the impact on animals, and it is true. Sometimes, like particularly when I talk about meat, I end up sounding like the cows in those Chick-fil-A ads, where I'm basically saying eat more chicken because it's 10 times better for the climate and for the planet. And as Jenny pointed out, it does suck for the chickens, and chickens get treated worse than cows. What I try to do, or at least what I should be doing, is just I'm giving the facts and I'm pointing out the data and the science. And here, if your issue is the 60 billion chickens that are getting eaten every year and you want to reduce that, then yeah, you should stop eating chickens. If you care more about the fact that beef, that we get 3% of our calories from beef in the United States, and it uses more than 50% of our agricultural land, then eat less beef. And of course, if you want to deal with with both of those issues, you can go vegan, and that's even better. I've personally cut out beef and lamb from my diet. We kind of all the level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with. But again, the nice thing about alternative proteins, whether it's plant-based or cultivated meat made from cells, or mycelium, that addresses all the problems of animal agriculture. And I do point out that when we're by eating the earth, that ain't great for wild animals either, right? I mean, now the livestock on Earth outweigh the wild animals on Earth like 30 to 1. And so that's crazy. But you're right. My old podcasting partner, Tamar Haspel, always says that food is all trade-offs all the time. And I do think that, there are definitely some win-win situations. I mean, I guess I would point out that the number one trade-off that I'm trying to wave my hands in the air about is, and this comes up a lot in the Michael Pollan world, right? Is that there's the trade-off of the acre that you are looking at, where it's like, look how I'm farming. It is more natural. It is better for the microbiome. It is better for the soil. It is kinder and gentler. And that is true. But what I am trying to point out is that acre has impact on other acres. And if you are making half as much food, then you need twice as many acres to make food. And maybe that 1 acre is a little bit better than that industrial acre that's drenched in chemicals. But if you need 2 acres, you are tearing down an acre of rainforest, and that is worse. And that is the trade-off that I think has been forgotten. Literally, climate analysis of biofuels and of agriculture generally ignored land use until Tim Serchinger came along. And I am trying to say that land matters. Land is not free. Every acre is sacred, that we really are going to have to get as much food and as much carbon storage out of every acre as we can, because like they say, they ain't making any more of them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think when we talk about trade-offs, we have to recognize there's a magnitude issue. If, for example, something is 3% less efficient, but a lot better for, say, local water pollution and the rural community, and therefore really changes the political dynamic, that's an important trade-off that is very different than something that is, 100% less efficient and doesn't make much difference. Another thing I think we have to think about is, yes, there are a lot of trade-offs we have to deal with, but there are some wins that aren't that much trade-offs, and we should try to get them and win them and build momentum. And Molly talks about biofuels. We've sued EPA twice already, and we'll probably have to do it again over their renewable fuel standard, because they don't take climate change into account, and they are proposing ridiculous new volumes that would require millions of new acres of soybeans to produce the volumes that EPA is producing. And since pretty much all the land has already been converted in the US, that is probably going to mean millions and millions of acres of tropical forest deforested, simply because of this EPA rule, not because the market demands it, not because consumers demand it. This will cost consumers $20 billion more, but simply because the political forces behind EPA are going to mandate it. So yes, there are trade-offs, but there are some things that we should just really push to end that are just plain stupid, like crop-based biofuels, like food waste. There's a lot of food waste that we can do something about if we put our minds to it. Now, I remember, by the way, when working on energy efficiency, we ran into the problem that if you're an electricity producer, you sort of love it if people air condition with their windows open, because you're selling more electricity, even though that is clearly a waste. So we have to recognize that everyone loves to say they don't like food waste, but many producers actually don't mind food waste. If you're selling it, you're happy for people to waste it. So we can do more on these sort of what you might think of as low-hanging fruit, and build some momentum, as well as some dialogue, some platform for talking about the solutions that do require some trade-offs.
I do just have to point in a little brag here that I do mention in the book that when the ethanol industry made its top 10 enemies list, the hero of my book, Tim Searchinger, was number 4. I was number 1. It just shows the power of the press. So
Nice.
Thank you.
Okay, there's lots of questions coming in, so I want to get right to those. Okay, first one from Mike. Did you look at nutritional quantity in addition to, I think it's like nutritional density, essentially, in addition to just like calories? And is there potential to increase variety and quality of plant-based foods in addition to reducing red meat consumption?
I do sort of put myself out there as an expert on a lot of these, kind of food and climate and environment issues. On nutrition, I kind of know just enough to be dangerous. But my general sense is like the real, like nutrition, there's so much, food dyes and, what pesticides are being used on your food. And like that stuff is what really matters is what you're eating, and it's, and so this idea, this is like, you can look at the labels. It's like this much protein, this much carbohydrates. If there's a lot of sugar, it's probably bad. If you're smoking too much, that's bad. These things are pretty basic. And the idea that, certainly I think, in the organic industry, they suggest like, oh, well, yeah, maybe we're only making half as much food per acre, but it's more nutritious food. And there's just very little evidence of that. There's not a lot of evidence that eating organic generally is going to be better. I mean, people who eat organic tend to eat more fruits and vegetables and less Twinkies and Doritos. And fruits and vegetables are definitely better than Twinkies and Doritos. But the environmental problems of organic and even regenerative, which is the new buzzword, that kind of food is, to the extent it's offset at all by, higher bioavailability or nutrition, it's not fully offset.
So there is a guy I worked with, Gus Schumacher, who was one of the really great food policy guys, I think Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, who used the phrase that we should be thinking about nutrition per acre rather than bushels per acre or calories per acre, because ultimately we're producing food that is supposed to nourish us. And we are producing a lot of stuff that may have high yield, but actually is very low in nutrition. A lot of sugar, for example, or a lot of other crops that then are used super inefficiently. So I think that metric of thinking of it as nutrition per acre is a really interesting way to think about yield improvement. What's the
But that's an
ultimate
issue on the
goal?
demand
Healthy
side,
people.
right? That's an
Yeah.
issue on the demand side, right? Like
Well,
they're
and the
growing high
policies.
fructose corn syrup because that's what Americans want to eat. You know, that's not the farmer's fault.
I think there's always a link between demand and policy, since so much of demand is created by policy. We have the checkoff programs, as you talk about, that are government-run programs that force producers to pay into them, that are designed to increase the market for their goods. So $70 million a year in the beef checkoff program, entirely focused on increasing the market and the demand for beef. So I think of the two as linked. Demand is not just out there. Demand is very much shaped by advertising and other programs like these checkoff programs.
I mean, I will say that I think, you know, we've started eating meat as our ancestors did 2 million years ago, and we literally evolved to sort of enjoy the taste of meat. I think, I don't like those checkoff programs. I think they're ridiculous, but I think people eat beef because it's delicious. And I miss it every day. And I do think like that's why we need to put in incentives to try to have people eat less beef. And I think we need to, promote improved pastures and other sorts of forms that can make beef more efficiently. So it's maybe only 4 times as bad for the climate as chicken instead of 10 times as bad. But I think that it's essentially, these are demand issues. And I don't, when Tim Searchinger was asked once after giving a speech, like, if beef is so terrible, what do you think American ranchers should be making? And he said beef, because they make it efficiently and people want it. And as long as people want it, it's got to be produced.
Well, I think what you're both touching on is this sort of like taste part of it. Like these plant-based alternatives still have to taste good. There's all this talk about ultra processed foods and how we define that, when it seems to me like the problem is like, I mean, and Tamar says this all the time, so I'm stealing from her, but like it's sugar, fat, and salt. Like, it's not really this magical thing just because you call it one thing or the other. And I guess that just leads to a question about like, how are there ways to incentivize eating some dietary change, which is like people are allergic to this conversation in this country. I mean, even you, Mike, are like, I don't want to be a scold. I'm not gonna, say certain things, and of course, like no one wants to be a scold. No one likes a scold, but we have to eat less meat, right? Like it just seems like, can we have a conversation about that where people just, that doesn't mean necessarily going vegan, but can we just at least kind of get on board with like cutting back and making and incentivizing of that a little bit? And maybe that's more investing in tastier, all proteins. I don't know, or maybe that's nudges in hospitals and some of that way. But those seem like good things that, like, as you say, Peter, like the low-hanging fruit that maybe we can agree on. Because we just seems like we can't kind of, hang everything on hoping for everyone eating lentils. That's just obviously not going to happen, right?
Right. I do try to not be a scold, but it is also true that, like, the average American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. And that if it was only 2, that we'd save a Massachusetts worth of land every year. So I do push back against this, the environmental community and the climate community has pushed, it used to be back in the 70s and the Earth Day era, it was like, we have seen the enemy and he is us. And now it's like, oh, that's bad. No, we don't want to blame the victim. We don't want to blame, it's not about individuals. It's about, Donald Trump sucks and Exxon sucks and McDonald's sucks and JBS sucks. But I don't like that. I think I think it's fine to think about our own personal carbon footprints. And as you mentioned, to the extent that nudges can help, that's great. I wrote about that program in the New York City hospitals, where they just do plants by default. They offer patients plant-based meals. And if they don't like it or they don't want it, they offer them another plant-based meal. And if they don't want that, then they offer them meat, and that's great. But it turns out it's voluntary, and they've increased, it used to be 1% plant-based meals. Now it's 51%, and they've reduced their emissions by a third. So I think that's great. I do think when you start to get into like really telling people what to do. I do quote a pollster in the book who told me that taxes on meat or other restrictions on meat are the least popular policy he's ever polled. His quote that it's like up there with veterans benefits for ISIS. So, I do think that these things are hard, but again, better is better than worse, even if perfect isn't on the menu. And I do try to I try to eat less beef, and even if I eat more chicken instead, that's better.
I just want to follow up a little bit on Mike's talking about nudges, which is important. I guess I don't think that demand is just what it is. Demand is in part created, including by this multi-billion-dollar advertising industry, much of which is supported by the Checkoff program, and then by these companies that don't have to pay their true costs and therefore have a lot of extra money for advertising. I think price matters. If that was one of the challenges, say, with clean energy. At first, it was more expensive. Now it's cheaper. Right now, alternate plant-based proteins are often more expensive. But that's in part because the slaughtered protein doesn't reflect its true cost. It's heavily, heavily subsidized, both directly and by being allowed to pollute in ways that the alternatives don't. And so it's not a question of forcing demand one way or the other, but I think it is a question of recognizing that demand is a function of many, many different aspects, advertising, culture, and pricing. And government policy can affect a lot of that. And as Mike said, what you serve first can make a difference. Schools that took trays away reduced food waste tremendously. It turns out that a student with a tray loads it up and then throws half of it away. Simply take away the tray, much less food waste. So there's a lot of things like that that we can do that can affect demand in a way that is entirely consistent with our sort of overall market approach.
Just to point out, to jump in on alternative proteins, which I think I'm glad you mentioned that. I do think, like, for instance, Jenny mentioned there's this whole idea that it's ultra processed food. And that is, like, I interviewed the guy who basically coined the phrase ultra processed food and has sort of led the charge against that, Kevin Hall. And he told me that he thinks plant-based meat has been unfairly demonized. It's not health food, but this is not what he was talking about with plant-based food. But I would also say that the industry, particularly Beyond Meat, has really pushed the idea that there's been this horrible conspiracy to, that's why we're struggling in the market. That's why our stock went from $250 a share to $2 a share. It's because we've been demonized by this powerful industry. But honestly, I think it's like pretty clear what happened is that, the stuff came out and everybody got excited because it tasted better than the old sort of hockey puck veggie burgers. And everyone, and that was great. And there was this big boom, but it turned out that people didn't like them better than meat. The dogs didn't like the food. And so I think ultimately the challenge is going to be, can it be like Tesla? Can it make a better mousetrap? And that will, and that government can help with research to make it better, taste better, and, and be healthier and cost less. That's, over time, the cow is a pretty mature technology and this stuff is not. So I'm very hopeful about it, but I don't think we should hand wave away and pretend that, people are being fooled into not eating it. They don't like it yet.
There's also a lot of pushback around kind of meat is cheap because of subsidies. I know I've received that pushback on Twitter, so I want to make sure, or X or whatever we're calling it. So, I mean, I think like meat is also just cheap because the corn's cheap, the land, is cheap. But also, as you say, like there are these costs that we really don't account into, the polluting costs. So I think that is part of why this issue is so hard, in that none of this is a really exact science. I shouldn't say none of it. I guess there's a lot of strong numbers, but I mean, things like what makes people eat meat is not going to be an exact science exactly. It's a little this, a little that. So it's and what incentivizes people to, you know, eat this burger is also a little complicated. Where is it in the store and all this stuff? So I guess I just want to acknowledge that like there are a lot of talking points that come up like that, where I think, you know, it is just kind of obscuring the fact that it is really just hard. It is really just challenging to figure out how to get people to eat less meat. Obviously, like we haven't done very much on it, despite some of us writing about it over and over again for the past few years. Like we've gone in the wrong direction. So yeah.
But it's not like, you know, the world eats 350 million tons of meat every year. I don't think they're just getting tricked into it. You know, it's like shit tastes good.
I think there's also just important lessons to learn from energy, where we're 20 or 30 years ahead. You remember the compact fluorescent light bulbs, which were an attempt at having more energy efficient light bulbs. They were sort of terrible. Right now, we've all using LEDs, which actually are a whole bunch better than incandescent light bulbs. A refrigerator today uses about 15% the energy of a refrigerator when I was a kid. And it's bigger, it's got more gizmos, and it's a better product, and it uses a tiny fraction of the energy. So it's a long game to shift this. But we can't lose track of it. And it is interesting, as I said earlier, the fossil fuel industry fought tooth and nail against energy efficiency and clean energy. And we had to sort of push back against them in court and in public utility commissions and in public media. And it seems very parallel to what's going on here. The incumbent industry is fighting like crazy to prevent the new industry from surviving and growing. And we have to try to level the playing field for the new industry.
There's a question here about farmer perspectives that I want to pick up on and maybe expand on. The question is there opportunity to frame farmer objectives on protecting animal welfare because healthy animals are productive and therefore also profitable? Like, is there an opportunity there? And I think maybe like even bigger, like are there opportunities to kind of get farmers on board with sort of better policy? I think sometimes there is a bit of mythology around, like, even with these checkoff programs, like all farmers sign on for this. And there's lots of farmers who are like, you know, maybe they don't all want to say it on the record, but who are like, I don't like that. I don't love that the checkoff program gets all of our money and then spends on sometimes like dumb advertising that I'm not even interested in, or policy, or like fighting Prop 12 in the case of pork producers. There's a lot of pork producers who are like, I made the change and it's actually fine. So I'm wondering if there are opportunities to kind of work with farmers while also having some accountability for, you know, the damage that industrial animal ag causes, right? Not just going like, here you go, ethanol farmers, like corn farmers have everything, you know. Are there some paths forward where we might be able to kind of rein in ag and also get farmers on that side?
Well, I've gotten some flack for telling the story of the guy in the feedlot, you know, who runs a feedlot in Colorado in my book. And he took me into the middle of the feedlot and he rolled down the windows and he said, "Oh yeah, you hear that?" And I was like, "Well, I actually don't hear anything." And he's like, "Exactly. You're surrounded by 25,000 beef animals. You hear any of them bellowing? You think they've been abused today?" And his point was, I think bellowing is supposed to be a cross between bellowing and hollering, maybe. But anyway, they weren't doing it. And his point was that it's not in his financial interest to abuse his animals. That basically every inch of stress that they have is money out of his pocket. So he makes it, he sends riders to their their paddocks every day to make sure that they're feeling good, to make sure that they're, they don't have foot rot, to make sure that they don't have to walk through their manure. And there is some synergy between efficiency and and animal welfare. And he knows he's like the busybody mayor who knows like everybody who's got every one of his 25,000 residents who has a cough. I do think there's something to that, but ultimately it's about getting the incentives right. I think, which is what Peter was saying, and I think you too, Jenny, that we want like I worry that right now that we're moving towards trying to put in some of these regenerative incentives, where it's like we're going to reward people for these bogus farming, carbon farming stuff, like, you know, where if you do X, Y, and Z, we're going to assume that you're repatriating carbon from the sky to your soil, which you really are not. We're going to give General Mills and Mars and all these other food companies, PepsiCo, you know, are pushing their farmers to take these regenerative practices because they think that's going to reduce their, you know, their carbon footprint, and they're going to get paid in the markets for that. And I think we got to get the incentives right to basically to incentivize more food and less mess and fewer emissions. And that is that may sound oversimplified, but I think if we focus on those three kind of big areas, then you know, and then let people figure out how to do that. If we measure it properly, then the farmers' incentives will be right. You know, I don't really trust the you know, these kind of command and control ideas that it's like, you know, we think farming should be like this, so we're just going to reward you for doing it because that's going to make, you know, Joe Rogan and Bobby Kennedy on the right and Bernie Sanders and Al Gore on the left feel good. I think there really has to be some numbers behind what we encourage farmers to do.
I think one of the things that sort of makes all of this complicated is some of the practices, like Mike mentioned, may be really good for water quality or local biodiversity. And so they may have some benefits. They may reduce say need for fertilizer, which can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they don't do anything for storing carbon in the soil, very little. And so there's a lot we need to understand. And going back to the research point, where there's just a lot we don't yet know enough about these practices. And they may be good in some very important ways, and they may be neutral on some other ways. And so, you know, overall, it may be something we want. And they also differ. It may be in some regions of the country, say rotational grazing maybe can make increase yields and increase soil carbon and protect water. In other regions of the country, it won't work. So it's a complicated issue. I think going back to the basics, this recent budget bill just spent $60 billion or sending $60 billion to farmers for really nothing good. And we should just really think and start trying to have a conversation, ideally a national conversation that includes the landowners, many of whom who would like to use their land for producing what society really needs, and think about, okay, how can we spend the money that we're already spending in a more intelligent way, maybe with some strings attached, but also to encourage maybe production of different foods that make a difference. So there's a lot of opportunities because there's already a lot of money out there. And so I think if you compare that to other areas where you have to both find the money and then figure out how to spend it well, we already have a lot of money in this system. Let's just figure out how to spend it better.
The question here about policies in places like Brazil, where, you know, there's really a risk of deforestation, and obviously other places as well. Like, what policies and types of farming could foster intensification of grazing systems, and also kind of make sure that basically it's just the intensification is not leading to more clearing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I went down to Brazil and I saw some degraded ranches where there was, like, you know, 1 cow per 10 acres and the cows looked like they were on hunger strikes. And then I went to these upgraded ranches where, you know, they did some things Michael Pollan would hate, like they fertilized their pastures, and they had these feedlots, very efficient feedlots. But they also did some, you know, true regenerative practices, like Peter mentioned, the rotational grazing, the letting the cows graze on the cover crops as well. And they had extraordinary yields. They had a cow on every acre, and so that meant they were using 1/10 as much of the Amazon. And in fact, Brazil has often done a pretty good job of incentivizing that stuff. Then they have some programs where if there's any deforestation in a province, they cut off farm credit in those regions. So which also gives the farmers a kind of an incentive to spy on each other and pressure each other. But I do think that in general, the incentive is going to have to be like, we're going to have lots of money to help you intensify, but there's also going to be there's going to be a real stick as well as the carrot. And that if the forests start coming down, the money stops flowing. And again, it's really hard, but it's sort of like the alternative really sucks.
Yeah, I was going to agree that we've got to look at this from a carrot and stick perspective, and too much of our policy in the US and really around the world has been all carrot, and we've been sort of afraid to have any sticks with respect to agriculture. And yet, to the extent it is now in many areas the biggest polluter, it should be treated like that. In other industries, we demand that they control their pollution, they report their pollution, they control it and limit it down to perhaps closer to acceptable levels. We can do that here, and we should. So it's a carrot and a stick is what we need in order to get a food industry that is, as you started, Jenny, starting this, sustainable and productive.
Since we're coming almost to the end now, and one thing we haven't talked about really that is an important topic for me is like, how do we get out of our silos? Like, what are ways we can do that? Because I think one of the things that is the most frustrating, at least as someone who writes about these issues, is that like, there's sort of the group over here that like, this is their favorite solution is, small farms, and everything kind of has that kind of tone. And then it, like, if your favorite solution is all proteins and like high-tech lab grown meat, like that's, you can say nothing wrong about that. I guess I'm just wondering like how we can, and one of the things I really liked about the book, Michael, is that all these people people I've talked to kind of over the years are in there going like, yeah, I admit, like, this doesn't actually taste that great right now. People were actually kind of, and regenerative folks were going like, yeah, like it doesn't look good for carbon sequestration right now in ag soils. We're trying to measure it, we're working on it. It's not that great. I would love to see more of that transparency. And I wonder, like, are there ways to have more conversations where people actually do that?
Well, needless to say, I'm all for it. I mean, they always tell you when you write a book that you need to have a tribe, right? But unfortunately, like every tribe has something not to like in my book, right? Like the vegans, the foodies, the hippies, the Aggies, even the climate hawks, and everybody's upset at me about something. But what I've tried to do is I do think that these different silos have things they can learn from each other. And I have, I always say that like what I want people, I think the world has not really grappled with these issues, with food and climate and food and the planet. And if nothing else, my book grapples, and I kind of want other people to grapple. And I start seeing some of these conversations starting to happen, even if they're like somewhat, accompanied by people throwing rhetorical tomatoes at me. But I do think that I'm trying not to be prescriptive, farm like this, eat like this. I'm trying to put out facts and data about how, if you farm like this, here are some of the trade-offs, here are some of the problems. If you eat like that, here are some of the benefits, and here are some of the ways it helps solve some of those problems. I feel like, that's kind of the goal. And I would like to see more people, crossing lines and talking about this stuff. Right now, I think certainly there have been some regenerative. I've been on some regenerative podcasts, and it's been great, and there've been great conversations. And then you also see in some of the regenerative world, there's this kind of like, I'm the evil empire, and we've got to like knock me down. But in a way, I'm happy to see that too, is like as long as people are discussing it.
I think one of the things that might work is, among other conversations, trying to make them a little more local. I think first of all, what practices work is going to be a very local issue, and there's nothing more convincing for a farmer than seeing somebody nearby do something with good results. But also in a local community, you can have perhaps a more open conversation about, where do we want? And some of those trade-offs we talked about. You can talk when it's your neighbor who's downstream. You can say, okay, we want to have it be very intense and productive, but we also don't want to hurt my neighbor. And so I think encouraging local conversations as well as the larger national dialogue or international dialogue can be very helpful.
Well, we're just out of time, so perfect timing. I want to thank everyone for coming, and also I think there's going to be a follow-up with the recording and also links to both of your books that people can purchase. And just finally, my executive director will kill me if I don't say, journalists in the audience, if you want to go to hear Mike talk about basically like all this stuff, but for journalists, how you can report on food and you can get all the complicated math and science part of it correct. Join us for a webinar on August 7th that's just aimed at journalists. Bring all your spiciest questions. We'll put Michael to the test. So hopefully I'll see some of you there. And thanks, everyone. Thanks to both of you for a great conversation.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Breakthrough.
Yes, thank you, Breakthrough.